And so, Alice, we know you, but we've started this off with everyone asking about your law beginnings. Like, what made you decide you wanted to become an attorney, and tell us about your law school experience.
Okay. Well, my father had a law degree. He never actually practiced law. He worked for a large insurance company, but I know that kind of influenced me. He wished he could practice, but because he had small children and he had an established career with this insurance company, he didn't feel like he could. So I had that as a background. And then when I was an undergraduate, I got my degree in social work. And as a part of that degree, I worked at the Women's Center. I was at NC State, and the Women's Center was on Hillsborough Street at that time. And one of the things they would have interns do is answer the phone. And so I took a lot of phone calls from women, and this is in the 1980s, the early 1980s. And I took phone calls from women who would say that their husband had just told them he was leaving and that the family attorney, the attorney that had done their real estate closing and had done their wills and all that, was going to be representing the husband. And I just thought that was really wrong. And I thought that was such a shame because these women, typically they were women who had not worked outside the home at that point in time and were very financially dependent on their husbands. And then to have the husband leave them and then the family attorney is taking the husband's side in it, it just seemed wrong to me. I was part of what I did as an intern and answering the phone was to try to connect the women to legal resources and those kinds of things. But that was really where I got the idea that if I wasn't going to go ahead and get a master's in social work, that I would go to law school. So I actually applied to both UNC School of Law and UNC's graduate program in social work at the same time and got into both. And so I had to make a decision. It was one of those really situations where there are two roads diverged in the wood. I don't think I took the one less traveled. Been going to law school, but I decided that maybe law school would suit my skills and my interests. And I really went to law school with the idea that I would leave and become a family lawyer and would be representing women. I didn't actually end up doing that, but that's what my original idea was and intent was. And I went to UNC School of Law, and I had a great experience there. I have friends who hated law school, just despised it, and felt like they didn't learn how to be a lawyer. For me, it was the first time I had had an education where everything related to itself. So the courses interrelated, and I felt like I was building on something, and that your first year classes led to your second year classes, and I really loved that. I loved that there was relationship and skill building and knowledge building that grew and grew and grew over the full 3 years. So I had a very good experience. I did the clinic program in my third year, a civil clinic in my third year, and that was a great experience in terms of exposing me to people who desperately need legal representation but can't afford it, and doing some good work for them. So that was law school.
And what years were you in law school?
I was in law school from 1982 to 1985. Graduated in 85.
So tell me about the makeup of your class.
Well, my class was interesting. We were kind of the second wave of women going to law school. There was a big wave of women who went to law school in the 70s. And they were really and truly trailblazers. They were the people that, there would be 2 or 3 women in a class of 150 kind of thing. Where some people thought that women shouldn't be there because they were taking a man's place in the class. And I even had friends who were told that, not at UNC Law School, but at another law school. We were the second wave. My class was the second wave. And it was really, I don't know that we thought of ourselves as trailblazers. I think we had come along much more with the attitude of it's appropriate for women to get advanced degrees and to plan on having a career. I mean, that we were really that first group of women that was really sort of always our mindset. that we had gone to college with that sort of mindset. My class was one of the largest classes that UNC had at that time and has had for a number of years. I think they've exceeded it in the many years since then, the 40 plus years since then. But at the time, they talked about us being the rat passing through the snake because we were so big. And the class, I think, was about a third women. So that we did not feel like we were, outnumbered, that we were necessarily even a minority in the law school. It was very interesting. There were a number of women who, unlike me, I took a break between some of my undergrad and law school, but not much of one. But there were a number of women who had careers, a lot of teachers, social workers, nurses, sort of traditional female careers, and particularly the teachers always made such an impression on me. These women were brilliant. They were so smart, and they had loved teaching, but they'd felt like they'd gotten no respect in teaching, that they hadn't had an opportunity to make decisions. And they were treated badly in terms of income and job circumstances. And they just said, I've had enough of this and I'm going to do something different, and gone to law school. And a lot of those women were exceptionally successful.
So your experience, it sounds overwhelmingly positive. Did you all have, I'm thinking 85, did you all have a 40th reunion last year?
No, we didn't have a 40th reunion. And I'm sure the law school had one, and I've actually been sort of involved in alumni affairs for the law school. But I think they're still kind of reconfiguring things since COVID. COVID threw everything off in terms of class reunions and all of that stuff. And so I think they're still trying to figure out how they want to do that. My classmates and I are still all in denial that 41 years have passed. So maybe we'll be over that by the time we get to our 50th anniversary.
Talk to us from the time that you left Carolina and you're going through your career. Take us on your career path.
So as I said, originally I thought I'm going to be a family lawyer. That's what I want to be. And I wanted to be in a small firm. I knew I wanted to be in a small firm. And my husband at that time, my first husband, had a career and Research Triangle Park, and he was also working on his PhD at Carolina, and so I wasn't going to leave the Triangle area. So I applied to small firms in the Triangle area. I didn't get a job right off the bat. There's a whole long story about people applying for jobs back then, but won't bore you with that. But I did not get a job right off the bat. But, to UNC's credit, the career counseling office called me after, and I had already passed the bar at this point. They called me and said, there's a small firm in Durham, and they're looking to hire an associate. So I went and interviewed with this small firm. It was Maxwell, Freeman, and Beeson. And Jim Maxwell was quite a well-known trial attorney at that time. I didn't know that. I was, really, dumb baby lawyer. But it was a good, solid, small firm. They had no associates. They had no women lawyers. I'm not even sure we had paralegals at that point in time. But I hit it off with Jim really pretty early in our interview, and they hired me. They hired me with the understanding that I was going to kind of shadow all three of the principals of the firm and sort of pick a career path based on that. And so with Jim, it was going to be litigation. With Jay Freeman, it would have been more commercial, small business, real estate, family law, estates and planning. And with Bob Beeson, it would have been some criminal law work. I also was hoping I would get into some domestic law. My first domestic client, and I learned the flip side of domestic law with her. She was very angry, very, very angry. I was very young, and I did not know how to control my client, which is something you have to learn. And she would yell at me over the phone. Back then we had literally had phones with cords and all that stuff. And I have this distinct memory of like her being on the phone, just yelling. Yeah. And she wasn't yelling at me. I mean, she was a typical domestic client who was just angry and hurt and whatnot. But the lawyer can end up being the target of that if you don't control the client. And I really didn't know how to do it. And I just had this revelation is I don't want to do this. I do not want to, be in this situation where my client is angry all the time and we're not, necessarily working towards a positive goal. So my phone's still up in the air. So I decided I wasn't going to do domestic law. And I had just a very general practice. It was great experience. I got to shadow Jim and carry his briefcase and do a little bit on the big cases that he had. And then the firm merged with another firm. And I was sort of the lucky child of that because I got to be got to shadow the lawyers with the other firm who did a lot of bankruptcy work. They did a lot of commercial transactions, large commercial transactions, and I got a lot of experience in that arena. But the merger didn't work very well. And it was clear that it was going to kind of break up along the original lines. And that put me in a very weird situation because I was doing a lot of my work with the firm that we merged with the partners in the firm we merged with. But the lawyers that I'd practiced with as really a newbie and had some deep emotional ties to were leaving. And so I just didn't know what direction I wanted to go in. Did I want to stay with one group or the other? I could have had that option. And I just decided, you know what, I'm going to look for something that's out of private practice. And I just thought I want to try something different. So I applied to the very first job that I heard of was the North Carolina State Bar, the regulatory agency for lawyers in North Carolina. And they, because of some real serious shakeups in the executive leadership of the State Bar at that time, the man who was the assistant executive director was being promoted to executive director, or had been promoted to executive director, and the assistant executive director position was vacant, and that's what I applied for. 7 years at a law school. I guess by then I'd gotten some chops as a lawyer, and but I didn't know that much about the State Bar. But I thought, this will be interesting, be very interesting. And boy, was that was just really pure luck because it was the first job that came along. I could have, it could have been that job wasn't there, and I would have gone a completely different career path. And I don't know that it would have been as interesting, as professionally satisfying, as personally satisfying as my actual career path with the State Bar was, which is phenomenal. What I got to do with the State Bar as the assistant executive director and ethics counsel for the State Bar was just wonderful.
And so that's a lot of time in Wake County, a lot of time at the State Bar. Describe the legal landscape of our state and of our city and our county, all of that you saw change through your career.
Whew. Wow, that's a tough one because really the change was happening when I graduated from law school and when I took my first job. I mean, the fact that my little tiny firm for lawyers merged with another firm in Durham, and it was like 11 lawyers or 12 lawyers. I mean, that was part of that whole era of the 80s where it was get big, grow your firm and take over business, take over other firms, and make a lot of money. I mean, frankly, I think there was a real impetus at that time that not only would lawyers do good, but they would do well financially. And so I saw that. But largely, when I first started practicing law, we were still a state that had predominantly solo and small firms. but it was just the beginning of the large firm movement where you have smaller firms merging, you have out-of-state big firms coming in, and, they call it a merger, but they were really acquiring the firms in different cities, particularly Charlotte and Raleigh, the obvious locations, right? When I went to the state bar, there was still a tremendous number of solo practitioners and small firm practitioners. And frankly, those were the people who would contact me for ethics advice. Typically, the big firms would have an in-house lawyer who was doing their ethics work or doing their malpractice work, which included ethics work, or they would work with their malpractice carrier for ethics advice because of the overlap there. But I think the main thing that I've seen change over my 40-year career was going from a state that really was predominantly small firms, general practitioners, jack of all trades or Jacquelines of all trade, to firms that they're still there, the small and solos are still there, but more and more mid-size and very large firms. International firms that have an office here in North Carolina, and those large firms having their own in-house counsel and in-house ethics advice and all of that stuff. At the other thing I think that changed, and this is not for the good for the state, is lawyers concentrating more in urban areas. So that's left us with what we now call legal deserts. When I was first practicing law, we didn't talk about legal deserts because every small town had a couple of lawyers. And the joke was, you had to have at least 2 lawyers in the town because you had to have somebody to do business with, right? And that was the case. And they were general practitioners too. I think that is a huge change that we've seen, is the sense that a lawyer could do everything. And maybe that was true back in the mid-'80s, that you could get enough experience and training that you could handle the range of issues that the members of your small community would have. One of the things I did at the state bar was to grow the specialization program. I was the director of the specialization program. And when I first went there, that was I wore all these hats at the state bar. I got them all right when I started working there. They just started giving me different hats to wear. And I was director of specialization. The program had been around since 85. It actually started the year I graduated from law school. But it only had, I think at that time, maybe 5 specialty certifications. And it was definitely the bastard stepchild of the state bar. The lawyers who were in would be not my age group now, their 60s, really didn't like specialization. There was a whole myriad of reasons why they didn't like it. I also always personally felt like many of them considered themselves de facto specialists in certain areas of the law, and they didn't like the idea that somebody who'd only practiced for 5 years could take an exam. They had to do other stuff too, but could take an exam and become certified as a specialist. So there was a lot of resentment against the specialization program when I first went to the state bar, which is 1993. And we fought that and fought that and fought that until nobody cared. And that, I would say, was probably within about 15 years. It took a while to get there. But in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, 2010, in that era, the lawyers who were coming out of law school said, well, we don't care. We want to be specialists. We want to specialize. And I think the lawyers who'd been around for a long time realized that they were worried about competition, and they realized this is not going to create a competition issue. And then many of them, I think, finally recognized that the reason we had a specialization program was to combat bad advertising. There really was a very legitimate reason to have a specialization program, is so consumers could make good decisions about who to hire. And so that antagonism towards specialization really dissipated and doesn't exist now. Another piece of that is that the vast majority of lawyers now are specializing. Even if they don't become certified, they're narrowing their practice areas because it just became that the law was too complicated to be a generalist and to be competent at every practice area. So even in the small towns where you have generalists, but they're generally kind of gatekeeper type people, like you would at your general practitioner doctor. They're there to be able to spot issues and send you to somebody who's, oh, I don't do criminal law, but my friend down the street does criminal law. He's who you need to see about this. I don't do workers' comp, but here's a lawyer that I know in the next community over who does. You need to go see that person. And that is so accepted now that the whole pushback on specialization has really just dissipated. And the program has grown. I think they have over 14 specialty areas now.
Yeah. When you look back on initiatives like that at the state bar that you spearheaded and took on, and what goes through your heart? What's that pride that you feel when you know that you've made that change?
Well, I didn't start the program. So I walked in and was told, okay, now you're the director of specialization. And so I don't take any credit for the idea. And actually, just as an aside, because lawyers might find this interesting, the specialization program started when the state bar was studying whether to have mandatory CLE. Yes, and they were so concerned about the pushback against mandating that lawyers take CLE that they also looked at specialization at the same time, because a specialization criteria has always included a continuing education component, that you had to take continuing education in the practice area you want to be certified in. And they adopted the specialization program before they adopted mandatory CLE, because they thought, well, everybody will want to be a specialist, and so that will get them to take CLE in the practice area that they want to excel in, they want to become specialists in, and we won't even have to mandate CLE. Well, that didn't happen. As I told you, there was all this pushback against specialization, and so that didn't happen. And so within just a few years of starting the specialization program, realizing that was not going to be what happened, they adopted mandatory CLE. Also, in the year I graduated from law school, 1985. But the specialization program was really near and dear to my heart still, because I thought it was such a great program for lawyers who wanted to take the next step. And lawyers are type A personalities, most of them are. And except for the ones that just, didn't want to take on the challenge or felt they were de facto specialists. There are just a lot of lawyers that wanted to say, okay, I reached for the bar of passing the bar exam. Now I want to reach for the next one. So I was really proud of growing the program. We grew during the time I was the director. I think we went from 5 to 11 specialties or we have some subspecialties. We developed a lot of procedures. We had to develop procedures for taking away somebody's certification. I mean, there was a lot of just, maybe considered bureaucratic development, but it was necessary for the program to thrive, and that we kept it going. And financially, it became self-supporting, which are all things I'm tremendously proud of. And there's an awful lot of lawyers that have become board certified that they did it not because they could sell their practice more. Some of them did it for the competition reason, but many of them did it simply for that reason that I said, that they always wanted to set the bar higher for themselves. It was to prove to themselves that they were practicing at this higher level. And I always thought that was the best reason to become certified. And yes, I'm very proud of that.
You touched on some things, and another source of pride for a lot of people in the legal profession are the mentees that they brought up along the way. And you mentioned some of the mentors in your career. Talk to me about the importance of mentorship, both as mentor and mentee, through a legal career.
Wow. Well, I was incredibly fortunate. I had mentors in my small firm that I started with. One of my favorite stories about and all three of the lawyers that I worked with there were my mentors in different ways. One of the guys I'll never forget, when I was working on a civil procedure issue, and I was not sure what the answer was, and I went to talk to him about it, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, Alice, have you read the rules of civil procedure?" And I hadn't really read them fully since I've studied for the bar exam and all of that. And I just always thought that was such a great lesson for me, is like, before you go to your mentor, you better do your homework. But I've had great mentors. I think the guy who was the executive director of the state bar when I went there, Tom Lunsford, was my mentor and also became a colleague and friend. It was one of the most gratifying professional relationships of my career. That way we would work together and really, reach the point where we were learning together and accomplishing things together. And that was really, really wonderful. But I think mentors are critical. Unlike the medical profession, which has a built-in training component to getting you to the level of actual medical practice. For lawyers, there's clinics in law schools, but they're typically a semester or a year. And you don't really have the experience and the wisdom. I think it takes wisdom to be a really good lawyer. And that's what you get from a mentor relationship as a young lawyer, is you can have somebody that you can role model after, that you can ask questions to, and you can just see how to comport yourself. And I think all of that's really, really critical for young lawyers, and really throughout your career. You have mentors at different stages of your career. I have a mentor right now in my retirement. So, it's something I think in life that is beneficial.
And I'm sure that there are many who would name you as a mentor. What was as you moved on in your career, what was your best advice to the mentees that you had who looked to you?
Oh, I don't know. I think I can't think of any one piece of advice that I gave people. Well, there was at the state bar, one of the pieces of advice to the state bar, the governance structure is that there are officers and there are counselors. It's like a little legislative body. Those are all volunteers. And then there's the staff. And so I frequently told my staff members to put a volunteer between themselves and a hard decision. So, and that was always good advice, actually. I don't know. I think being your authentic self is really important, and being honest and not being afraid to admit, well, that didn't work out. That wasn't the right thing. But all is not lost. You just try something new and something different. That's what lawyers are great. That's one of their key skill sets, is being able to look at a problem and try to find a resolution to it and then pivot if it's not the one that's going to achieve the goals that your client wants. So I think in my role modeling, I can't think of instances where I've actually sat down with people and said, well, let me give you this advice kind of thing. But in my role modeling, I think I modeled that approach to problem solving, is that we don't freak out and pull our hair out when something doesn't go the way we thought it would go. We try to think of another way to accomplish the end goal, the objective.
And how do you deal with, and you can give an example or not. Some people choose to, some will not. How would you deal with ethical dilemmas through your career? And what would you tell other younger lawyers dealing with ethical dilemmas through your career as an attorney?
So that's all I did for 25 years, is deal with actually other people's ethical dilemmas. So in my job as assistant executive director and ethics counsel, I manned the hotline. And when I first went to work there, I was the only lawyer doing this. It was all phone call based. That lawyers could call the state bar and they could say, I have an ethical dilemma. They'd usually say, I have an ethics question. And they would be put through to me. And then at a certain point in time, we started doing that in email too. Lawyers could always come in the office too. They could make an appointment and come in and have a live counseling session. So I was a lawyer's lawyer. I mean, earlier I said what a wonderful career was. One of the reasons it was so wonderful is because I got to be a lawyer for lawyers. And lawyers, for the most part, were really great clients because they would tell a story. They would, whatever their ethical dilemma was, typically they would tell it as a story, as lawyers are sort of trained to do. And usually they would have insight into the problem already in advance. And so we would problem solve together. And it was just really a great experience to problem solve together. And they were so grateful. I mean, I had a job where the lawyers were so appreciative of the advice they were getting and that they could rely on it. And it just was really gratifying. So you asked about dealing with my own ethical dilemmas. I'm trying to think. I had ethical dilemmas when I was a young lawyer in private practice. I'm not sure that as ethics counsel, I really, because of what I was doing, I've experienced a lot of ethical dilemmas myself. We didn't take any, I didn't do any pro bono work. I was sad that I didn't, but I felt like if I did, it would put me in a position of potentially having a conflict. So I didn't do any pro bono work. I was really entirely kind of dedicated to the ethics work and then assisting with running a bureaucracy, which is what the state bar is too.
So, and this might put you in an ethical dilemma because I don't know if you can talk about it, but did you have these cases that were high profile or public that people knew about? Any types of things that you worked at the state bar?
So the ethics hotline, that I don't know if they call it the hotline. I never called it the hotline, but the ethics phone call or email where you can get advice is all geared to the lawyer's own prospective conduct. And it's also confidential. It's confidential. So it was like a lawyer-client relationship that I had with the lawyers who called me. And it's confidential so that lawyers would call and they feel like they could rely on the advice they were given about their own conduct prospectively. So we weren't passing, judgment on something the lawyer had done in the past because they might actually get a grievance filed against them. And then, that would put me in between that, the grievance system and the ethics system. So it was very, very targeted towards helping lawyers with their own prospective problems and keeping that confidential. On occasion, I got an inquiry that would relate to a case that was getting a lot of publicity or a lawyer that was getting a lot of publicity. And I would just focus on the lawyer who was calling me seeking advice. If they were seeking advice about the conduct of another lawyer, then I would have to say, I can't help you. I cannot opine on what another lawyer's doing. But that might transition to a conversation about, did the lawyer I was talking to need to report another lawyer for unethical conduct? There's a rule of professional conduct that requires lawyers to report if they know another lawyer is engaged in unethical conduct. And so we would go from a lawyer who wanted to talk to me about some other lawyer's conduct to talking about that lawyer's conduct. But again, it was all confidential. So it didn't put me in any kind of dilemma. In fact, I guess that's a great way of insulating me as well, because I was not going to share any of the information that I had. The one thing I would add is the way the ethics program works. If a lawyer calls me, like I'm still doing it, right? Yeah. I did it for a long time. It's kind of ingrained in me. But if a lawyer would call me, and I would give them advice, and I made a contemporaneous record of it. This is all how it's still done with the ethics lawyers that are there now. And then the lawyers subsequently got a grievance that related to the conduct that we had discussed. The lawyer could say, well, I called Alice, and she told me to do this, and that's what I did. And at that point, he has waived confidentiality, and I could disclose that to the grievance committee. I could tell the grievance committee, well, yeah, Joe called me. He told me this is what happened, and this is the advice I gave him. But I could not make that disclosure until the lawyer I talked to had waived confidentiality.
Interesting. Okay. And my mind, as we're former news people, so my mind immediately goes to someone like Mike Nifong, who is very publicly disbarred. And I imagine through your career, you did have incidences of high profile things that were very aware. Did you ever feel like you were a part of North Carolina legal history?
Well, I mean, I think the Nifong trial is a good example of that. That was the single highest profile case that occurred while I was at the state bar. I was not involved in the prosecution of that at all. And I was really watching on the sidelines. And there may have been peripheral ethical issues that lawyers called me about. One great thing about being old and having a bad memory is like I can't remember any of that. So I absolutely, the confidentiality door is slammed shut on all that because I just don't remember. So there may have been these peripheral issues, but I wasn't involved in that. The outward facing part of that. That was probably the biggest thing. Before I got there, the guy who'd been the executive director was, there was some disclosures that he had taken funds from the organization. And it's a very long story. That would be an interesting story to have someone else tell because I wasn't there. But that was very, very high profile. And so when I went to the state bar, we were sort of in this rebuilding period of kind of reestablishing the credibility of the organization, which I felt like Tom Lunsford and I, who was the executive director, were a significant part of that. And that was really important to just rebuild the reputation of the bar with the bar at large, the membership of the bar, so they trusted the organization again. I mean, there's always kind of that distrust because of the disciplinary process, but that they believed in what the organization was doing to regulate the profession.
So it sounds like to me that you feel like maybe your impact on the legal makeup of North Carolina was really more internal of the legal profession, like the specialization, for example, that kind of thing. Maybe not something that people would know as public facing, but within our career or within the legal profession of our state. Do you feel like you're someone who really made a difference for our lawyers in our state, or do you hope so?
Well, I certainly hope so. I know I made a difference for individual lawyers. I know, I mean, I had frequent callers. I had people that, I mean, I'm still recognized by people who have practiced for more than 10 years, say, I'm recognized as the ethics person from the state bar. And I sincerely believe I helped lawyers. And I told you, that was one of the most gratifying things about my job. It was one-on-one. But in helping individual lawyers, I was helping the public too, because by fulfilling the promise of our rules of professional conduct, presumably, the profession believes this, presumably we're acting in the best interest of the individual client and overall of the legal system. And so, my impact was one-on-one with ripple effects that were beneficial, but I'm a background person, and that was fine with me. It was still very gratifying.
And tell us about something we've really tried to ask, because this is a professional look back. But tell us about life outside of the legal profession for you over the years, outside of being a lawyer, and was that balance important, and why?
Oh, yeah, the balance is really important. The balance is very, very important. The entire time I was at the state bar here in downtown Raleigh, I was living first in Durham and then in Chapel Hill. And so I was commuting. So I was doing, anywhere from a 45-minute to a 2-hour, whatever, crazy on Highway 40 commute. So I really had to have balance in my life to be able to do that. I've found it through having a routine exercise program, which has been harder to sustain in retirement than one would think. But I had a routine exercise program. I also had important personal relationships as well. Uh, I think having a good relationship with either friends or family that are supportive, have a very supportive spouse, supportive of my career. My job was such that there was never a day that dragged. I mean, I feel like I was incredibly lucky in that regard. Again, because my what I was doing was so interesting, and I was surrounded by the lawyers who were on the state bar council, the elected from their local districts, and the lawyers who became officers of the state were some of the best lawyers in the whole state. Great people. And so I made friends. And so when I was working, I was also interacting with people who I admired and also considered friends. And so that made it easier to have that work-life balance that I think it's harder for lawyers in private practice to have, because you don't necessarily think of your clients as your friends, and not always think of them as people you admire. So I think the stress for somebody in private practice was probably much higher than what I had. But I still think the work-life balance is critical, really, for all of us.
So I always wondered too, for example, last year when you came to the Bar Awards and you had a song sung about you. You remember what it was called?
Yeah, yeah. It was, oh, what was it? Was it the Cyndi Lauper song?
Missing Alice Vine.
Yeah, yeah.
When you've reached that point in your career, and for example, the bar is doing something fun to honor you as you're retiring, what on a night like that, and you hear something like that, even in its jest and fun, what goes through your heart? Does it cause you to reflect? Like when you hear something like that, like them writing that fun song about you retiring?
Oh, that was great. That was really fun. It just made me proud that I had impacted, some segment of the bar, that they were, giving me this honor. It's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek honor, but it's still quite an honor. It's lots and lots of fun, and it raises money for something really, really important. And I've also was sort of overwhelmed by it. I think I'm generally fairly humble, so I was humbled by that honor, but mostly just enjoyed it and thought it was great fun. Um, as I said, there were two roads I could have taken, and I took the one that took me to the state bar, and it was luck. There's really, truly, there's a lot in life that is happens because you're at the right place at the right time. And I was really, really fortunate to have that. And so I try to be humble, and like recognizing this award. And I had a really lovely retirement party in last January, a year ago, January. And it was also very humbling.
And so, if you were telling a young woman graduating from UNC Law School and starting her career as she graduates in May from UNC in 2026, what's your best advice to her, to any new lawyers coming into the profession?
I think the first thing you need to think about is whether you want to go into private practice. The great thing about a law degree is it's a very versatile degree. You can do all kinds of things with a law degree. And I worry that law schools, when I was going through, it was like we were being funneled into private practice. And some of that was because the students did that to themselves. We kind of reinforced that. But I think also it was coming from the administration and career offices and all that to some extent. I'm hopeful that that's not so much the case anymore, but I think that's really important for people who just graduated from law school to really look at, what is it I want to do? I think having some experience in private practice is a great launching pad. It's a great launching pad for working in government, for working as in-house counsel, for doing all kinds of things. But I think to keep your mind open that, this is my first few years of practice as a lawyer are an opportunity to kind of learn about the profession, learn what lawyers can do, and then stand back and say, what is it I really love doing, and what don't I like? And where would my talents and my interests be encouraged and develop as opposed to feeling like I'm frustrated and stressed and all of that. So I think it's very easy for people who just graduating from law school to think they need to do one thing and they're going to just do that thing. And I would advise somebody, think of this as how do you want to learn and develop over the course of your career? What do you want to learn now so you'll better understand yourself as a lawyer and can make decisions about where you go from there in 3 or 5, or for me, it was 7 years. And instead of getting locked into one thing. And then I think there's a fair amount of unhappiness in the legal profession. And I think a lot of that is a result of new graduates from law school thinking this is what they're supposed to do. It's why they got the training. So they're supposed to do it and they're supposed to like it. And they don't really like it. And that's fine if you don't like it. Learn what you can learn from your first job or jobs, and then transition to what you really do like doing. With all those skills, legal skills are great skills. Whatever you do in life, they're great skills. And just take those and move on to the next step.
And last question, you spent a lot of your career dealing with ethics and professionalism in legal career. Your best piece of advice on professionalism for attorneys?
So I always struggled with that because professionalism is kind of this amorphous thing. And it's, I think, in my world, the ethics world, it was often conflated with complying with our ethical obligations. And they're not necessarily the same thing. It's kind of like, to be a professional, you have to be complying with the rules of professional conduct. That's like the floor, right? That's sort of the minimum that you're doing. Professionalism is that next step, and it has to do with how you comport yourself and how you treat other people. And I think that's where mentoring, I think, is really critical, in understanding how to. And it's like act like a lawyer, behave like a lawyer. I don't even really like those terms. I think it's more about, not letting your emotions control how you behave, always being gracious and kind and giving the benefit of the doubt to other people, and being respectful of other people and respectful of yourself as well. That goes all the way from how do you carry yourself, how do you dress and all that. I did not wear my business clothes today, but it goes from that to, being in an adversarial situation. That's lawyers are off, not always, but, all the litigation is generally you're an adversary. But there's a paragraph in the preamble to the Rules of Professional Conduct that I helped to draft that talks about just because you are on the opposite side of a legal question from another lawyer doesn't mean that you're adversaries in that sense, that you're enemies. It doesn't mean that you're enemies. And you should always behave in a professional, courteous, polite, understanding way to opposing counsel, to the opposing party, and to really everybody who's involved in the legal system. And I always thought that was such an important thing. And that's really, like, for me, at the core of professionalism.
So what are you doing now? Retired?
I'm retired. Do a little bit of consulting work.
Yeah.
And don't know how I feel about that, having to, work.
Are you going to travel? Or?
Well, yeah, very much. We're doing a lot of traveling. Actually, we're leaving for New Zealand in 2 weeks.
Cool.
Yeah, it's cool. My stepdaughter and her family moved there from Durham, so we're So we have mixed feelings about the New Zealand because we miss our grandchildren. But we're going over there to see them and see the country, and we'll be in Australia for a little while too.
And how old are the grandkids?
They're 7 and 11, almost 12.
That'll be fun.
Yeah.
So you have 2 grandchildren?
We have 2 up in upstate New York too. So we have got 4 altogether. So it's a long way. It's the other side of the world. We're going to Alaska in July. We're going to Great Britain in August. It's a crazy year. We probably won't travel this much in the future, but my husband's older than I am, so we want to. These are our go-go years. They're the go-go's. They're the go years, and then they're the no-go years. So we're sort of between go-go and go. So we're doing that. I've done some pro bono work since I retired, which I really found to be very gratifying, which I didn't do when I was at the state bar because I felt like it was a conflict. And that's been really, really interesting. I'm on the board for Legal Aid, and that's a very gratifying board position too. So, and then I'm doing some this and that,
Well, thank you so much.